My task today, or the remit I agreed to today, was to get you thinking about one aspect at least of the future of Catholic education. There's lots to being a leader. There's lots of different things you need to juggle and keep in mind. Your own expert witness, Greg and others and your office staff and each other, keep you informed and educated about those things. But I'm just singling out one thing, although I think it's a very central thing, and it's that challenge of keeping Catholic schools Catholic. It's always been hard, of course. Being a leader of a religious school, it's never been harder. Never been harder. But I'm suggesting to you it's going to get harder still, and you need to brace yourselves for that, and you need to be secure about that and confident about that. It's no fun these days. It's a big challenge these days, just being Catholic or being a religious person in modern Australia. And let alone to be the number one Catholic in your community, as each of you must be as the leader. That's a particularly challenging thing, and it's a testing thing from time to time. And in the current climate, for a range of reasons we're going to talk about, it's perhaps more difficult than ever before, more threatening than ever before. It provokes crisis in people. I've seen it. It provokes crisis of leadership. It provokes crisis of faith, of course, and particularly to be part of the Catholic Church and to admit in public, as you do often, to that old party question, what do you do? I'm a Catholic school leader. For many in society, being Catholic is such a negative thing. It's got a whole baggage that's accumulating around it. So it's how we deal with some of that and what that is saying to us and how we get on top of it. So that's where we're going. And at the end, I want to just make some suggestions to you, not to solve the problem, not to give you the magic bullet solution, but to get you thinking about some of these issues and suggesting to you that you really need to start thinking and trying to get ahead of the game to sort of put you over the horizon radar to work on some of these issues. But I want to begin somewhere completely different. Now, this may be totally meaningless to you, this photo. For some of you, you will recognise it or a scene like it. You'll know what's going on there. But for others, you'll be completely puzzled. You've had your warm-up, so I won't do the hands up. This is a sunny Sunday afternoon a couple of weeks ago before the football match involving the Miami Dolphins. This is the Miami Dolphins preparing for their match. It's the great ritual of American society on Sunday as teams play each other all over the country. But it's been rather fraught in the last 12 months or so. In the pre-season of 2016, about August 2016. And what led up to that, you will remember, a whole range of incidents involving police shootings of black teenagers mainly, and some riots in American cities of blacks, Ferguson, for example. And in August 2016, the quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers, at this ritual, at this point in the match, the very beginning where they're singing the national anthem, he knelt down on one knee, which is something a quarterback does. It's called taking a knee. And to explain that and to justify that gesture, he said it was in response to the police brutality, the police shootings of black people. He's black. And as long as that wasn't being dealt with, as long as black and white in American society weren't reconciled, he couldn't in all conscience contribute properly to the national anthem as the symbol of what is America. And what has happened since, briefly, is that's caught on in different ways. And it's been fuelled recently by President Trump, who said at the beginning of this season, it didn't start with Trump, at the beginning of this season, anybody who kneels for the national anthem, instead of standing properly with hand on heart and singing it meaningfully, ought to be sacked. And so it's great. Now you'll see in this photo the team laid out there, some with just sitting on their knee, not singing anything. Some are on their knee with hand on heart, and some, of course, are standing in the normal fashion. What's been happening is that crowds boo, players lose sponsorships. It's been a very, very polarising issue. And it's taken on a whole life unto itself. And what's of interest before each match is, what are the teams going to do? How are they going to handle this one issue? Because in American culture, the national anthem, unlike ours, is the pinnacle. No American ever needs a prompt with the words. And we of course do. And if you've ever watched the Wallabies, say, before an international rugby match, you know, when the camera pans along while the national anthem's been sung, you'll see most of them haven't moved their mouth at all, and others are looking all over the place. We don't have that same passion about our national anthem and the symbolism of it. There's perhaps a reason for that. One day when we have a proper national anthem, we might feel differently, okay? That's another question for another day. But in America, it's become a very important issue. And it's taken on various forms. You'll see here, hopefully you can see from the back, just two separate, these are all very recent photographs, by the way, two different ways of dealing with this. It was taking the knee, and now we've got the black salute as crept in for some. And you might remember the 1968 Olympics black salute and what that meant. And now then here on the right-hand side is the college band playing the national anthem. And you'll see that some of them are managing the tuba, kneeling on one knee. It's all part of this growing polarisation within American society and American culture, and it's been triggered by a range of things, that it's created an intensity that most Americans haven't seen for a long time. And it's fuelled, of course, by media and social media in a particular way. And it's the notion that, well, this is not my country, this part of it. Or Trump is not my president. This is not my America. So there's this sense of separation. What's this all got to do with Catholic education? Well, I'll explain that in a minute. But just to summarise what I can discover out of this, because this, I think, is the relevant part, what are the arguments for this and what are the arguments against it? Well, the main argument for it seems to be we cannot keep on doing this because, look, it's drawing attention to the issue of black and white in American society, the unreconciled issue, particularly the violence. The opposite, of course, the other deep passion is, no, it doesn't. It shows deep disrespect for your country, deep disrespect for your flag, deep disrespect for your veterans, and that, of course, is a particular American approach to things. And these are the best paid blacks in American society. Kaepernick's paid 100 or 230 million a year or something. So for the black community, there's a polarisation as well. Anyway, that's it in a nutshell. What's it got to do with Catholic schools? Well, everything, at least in America. And I'm going to suggest to you it's touching on some of the issues that are relevant for us and in our society too. Because in America, football is a kind of a secular religion, as it often is in other places, south of the border, we'd say here, wouldn't we? And here's another photograph of two Catholic school teams playing on a college ground a couple of weeks ago again. Teams that are black and white and Hispanic. You've got to remember, when we get to church, that the American church is just about majority Hispanic, not white, just about. I think it's a couple of years' time the pendulum finally turns into majority, 51%. But here they all are, hand on heart, as the Catholic schools play. Because there have been all of these debates around places like this, principals' meetings, Catholic education officers, equivalent, amongst bishops. What are we going to do? How are we going to handle this? And here's just a collection of headlines, which I've got off the web, to show you how a diocese has been drawn into this. That's to say, a diocese is New York, Camden Diocese is in Pennsylvania. The diocese is saying to the school, you will not allow. Where does that leave us? Mainly negative, but in some cases, well, it's a matter of free speech. So people should be entitled to do that. It's a matter of solidarity. People should be entitled to do that. That's a very Catholic thing to do. So you can see the sorts of emotions that are being developed. What might we take out of that? What would they take out of it? I haven't read the commentary, but I imagine they're saying things like this. It's certainly symbolic, this one thing, this taking a knee. It's become symbolic of wider issues in church and state, and church is involved in this. It goes to the heart of the issue of what's called identity politics now. Identity politics being that whatever you are intrinsically, you might be male or female, you might be gay or otherwise, you might be black or white, but that's what matters. That's the whole of you all of the time. And that's how you are defined, that's your identity. But how does that sit with the common good? That's one of the key issues there too. What unites us rather than what divides us. I haven't looked, but I'm told if you look at the mere website, the homepage of the American Republicans and the homepage of the American Democrats, you'll see instantly what the difference is between the identity politics and the common good. It raises questions of religion and patriotism. Is that the final one? And what is secular and what is not? What is conscientious objection? Can you, particularly for a church-minded person, where do you draw the line? Freedom of expression and religion are obvious issues and they're central to us. But in terms of Catholic schooling, to take the second last dot point, where does authority lie? Can a bishop tell me that I can't make a gesture in solidarity with black people? And what if my school is mainly black, which is not uncommon in the US for a Catholic school? Where do we stand? So there are all the issues that are arising. Translating that into our local context, we can see, I think, the potential for that sort of single polarising issue that involves church and Catholic schools taking effect. The first headline actually is 2 days ago. It was a New South Wales minister calling for, and ministers do this periodically. Some of you might remember the Brendan Nelson's famous values poster, which we had to put up in schools a few years ago. Rob Stokes is saying we need lessons in Australian values, the idea of reclaiming a set of values that anchor points for us all, so we have something to agree on. Another headline there's a bit random, but it's to do with where religion fits in all of this. David Penberthy, who was as editor of the Telegraph at one stage, considered one of the most conservative of Australian journalists in that sense, he is saying that religion has no place in any of these public debates. Religion has no place in the same-sex marriage debate, for example, and should butt out. The other one is similar, religious freedom, which we talk about, and I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. Religious freedom is something that's outside politics. There's no entanglement with the community. There's no entanglement with what we call the common good. Religion is something separate, it's private, it's amongst consenting adults, not something you bring out into the public sphere. The context, though, in Australia for all of this is changing, as we know, and we're part of it, and we see it, and we surround it. It's these 5 things that I want to elaborate on a little with you, just to help you understand, or rather help put the bits together, each of which you've seen, each of which you know about, but how they fit together and what are the implications for schools and for me as a Catholic school leader. The first is the simple decline of religion in Australian society as reflected in the census. The second is, whether you realise it or not, Catholic school enrolments in Australia, in New South Wales and in Parramatta are falling. And there's a weakened support for Catholic schools in general, and particularly amongst Catholics, which I'll show you. Then, of course, there's the national marriage plebiscite, which I don't need to explain to you. I think, not irrelevant and kind of typical of the forces at work and the simple slogans at play here, are reflected in the media coverage of George Pell's going back and forth to court. And finally, there's the Royal Commission. And the Royal Commission, I'd suggest to you, is the most important of all, potentially the most long-term of all, and even if nothing much happens as a result of that in terms of the state, but it will, it's got great implications for the church. So let's take them one by one. The numbers may be a bit hard to read there. I'll leave this here if anybody ever wants a copy later. You saw the headlines when the census data was released a couple of months ago, the 2016 census. The headlines, of course, were the big learning from the census is Australia is now an atheist society. That the majority of Australians, the largest percentage of Australians, of course, have no religion at all. And that's what they put on their form on census night. That's true. And that's grown considerably between 2011 and 2016, presumably even more so for 2021 and 2026 and so on, though you must not fall into the extrapolation fallacy. Catholics used to be the #1 religious group in town. And they always were, from the first census in 1911 to 2011. But they've been knocked off their perch. A couple of things to say about that. There are serious implications, of course, if that's modern Australia, that the largest proportion, it's not the majority, but the largest proportion is no religion at all. Does that mean we're in a pagan society? Does that mean we're in a society that's anti-religious? Well, yes, parts of it are. But the other thing is, while the Catholic proportion has shrunk, and in fact the numbers, Catholics are still the very, far and away, the largest active religious denomination. These are people like you and I who on census night will have ticked the box, consciously ticked the box marked Catholic, a decision in itself. So when people get worried about Catholics having too much say, or Catholics being disproportionately influential in politics or in public life, or in the case of the same-sex marriage debate, being too outspoken or being too frequently outspoken, well, there's the explanation. They are a significant proportion of Australian society, and when it comes to a matter involving religion and faith, then they are going to be the main voice. You would expect them to be the main voice. And the others fade away. Interestingly, what's not there, I just cut it off at 2% for the visuals, but Judaism, we think of the Jewish, and where I live in the eastern suburbs, you think of it as a significant thing, and in fact where I live, the Catholics are #3 in the population distribution, but Jews are only 0.5% of Australia. So just a reminder of how things work. So there's a decline of religion in Australian society, or the growth of no religion, we'll put it that way. But it doesn't mean atheists, that Australia has now got 30% of Australians are atheists, as the headlines misleadingly put. Now, this is even harder, I'm sorry. What it's showing is the number of Catholics, the proportion of Catholics in each diocese. If it was clearer and larger and you could see it, what it's showing there is that the proportion of Catholics in Parramatta, in the physical area of Parramatta in the 2016 census was 5% fewer than it was in 2011. In other words, the number of Catholics in the diocese is shrinking. And that's also true of Sydney, and it's also true of Broken Bay. It's not so true of the country. The country is reasonably stable. But in the city, well, we don't have to go into the demography of it, but in the city, the proportion of Catholics is shrinking. And again, extrapolating that will occur over time. So that has got to have, by itself, some impact on Catholic schools looking ahead. And we're just talking about numbers of Catholics, not how Catholic they are or how committed they might be in search of a Catholic school. When you start looking at Catholic school enrolments, this is all of Catholic school enrolments, all students in Catholic schools, you can see this is just comparing 2008 to 17, but again, don't trouble yourself with the details of the data. The message out of that data is that Catholic school enrolments are declining across the board. They're declining across New South Wales. This started only a couple of years ago. It started in Parramatta sooner, but it's everywhere. And particularly in the city again, so there's a city-country division in a lot of this. But what is most striking, or at least striking to me when I saw the data, I had to go and check with the person who provided it. The far right column, you know, as principals, of course, you do a census in February and you do a census in August. Normally there's not much difference between them, except in high schools where Year 11 sorts itself out. But we have got now, we had in August, nearly 1,800 students fewer than we had in February. People are leaving all year and leaving quite significantly. In the case of Parramatta, you've lost 308 students in the course of the year. Now, that might be a one-off. That's the first time I've seen it as large as that, I have to say. It might be a one-off. This might be a Royal Commission effect. This might be people finally saying, well, after all the publicity of this year, I can't in all conscience leave my child in a Catholic school. There'd be a whole range of reasons, but that might well become to be one. We can't easily identify it otherwise. You can't unpack this, but I'll just do it briefly for you. If you could see, the colour contrast isn't very, very good, I'm sorry, on the presentation. It's clear on the slide. The red bit, if you can think of that as red, that is non-Catholic students. And if you look at the top column, which is comparing 1988 to now, we have fewer students. This is across the board. Think about this. We have fewer Catholic students in Catholic schools now than we had in 1988. All of the growth in Catholic schools, and it's been very substantial, in that period has been from non-Catholic students. And the bottom right-hand corner, the blue at the left, is the period from 2008, just the last 9 years really, and the blue is negative. That's the Catholics, right? That's how many fewer Catholics we've got in this period, and the red bits are the denominations. The big red bit at the bottom is no religion. No religion. The fastest growing group in Catholic schools is no religion at all, as it is for the population as a whole. So, again, we need to start thinking about that. It's growing and getting faster and larger. Now, why people who on census night consider they have no religion at all want to send their child to a Catholic school where they have no choice about it is something to think about. This is unfortunately the worst of all, but what it's simply showing you is over time the decline in the Catholic school population, particularly recently, is happening across the board and is equally true of Parramatta. So that's the general picture there. So we're in a situation where Catholics are shrinking in the population. The Catholic school population is starting to shrink everywhere, including here. And the largest group in Catholic schools, largest growing group in Catholic schools, is those of no religion. Okay? Let's move briefly to the plebiscite. I won't waste time on this because you'll be familiar with all the ins and outs of it. But here's just two visuals which are provocative, really, I think, and kind of summarise the polarity of it all. This is two activists who've crashed a no campaign function and unfurled their flag, which says, burn churches, not queers. Now, in modern Australia, and that is a pretty provocative statement. If it was the other way around, it would be a very provocative statement. The other one is a church war, and I've forgotten exactly where the church is. I don't think it's in Parramatta, where, and I know this has happened in lots of places, where somebody has sprayed graffiti on the side of the wall. Graffiti is an act of vandalism in other contexts, in other places, but it's symptomatic of the passion that this is all unleashed, and the religious and anti-religious tone that has crept in around it. And it's been a major challenge for churches everywhere. I was talking with Greg earlier about it's a spectrum, isn't it, of how the Catholic Church is dealing with this. And at one end of the spectrum, if you like, I don't think he's at the end of the spectrum, is the Bishop of Parramatta, who has produced a pretty clear and a pretty unequivocal statement about this. I think it's an excellent statement. It's not taking sides. And then at the other extreme, you've got bishops who are taking a side, and they're entitled to take that particular side. But if you've been watching the Herald this week, for example, as I have had time to do, the letters, of course, are all negative, but that's the Herald anyway. But you can see instantly, the minute the Archbishop of Sydney says something, it sets off a whole firestorm of protest and negativity. And you wonder, well, how productive is that? And how ultimately does that feed into people who are leading Catholic schools, teaching in Catholic schools, sending their kids to Catholic schools, or if they're old enough, are students in Catholic schools, thinking about and processing all of that. The next issue is media circus. There's no other word for it. That's been surrounding George Pell. Again, you've seen that. And my point here is to just remind you, if you need reminding, that in this case, for all his other shortcomings, George has been declared guilty before any kind of trial. The trial itself has become the issue in every media outlet in town. So far, there's only been a total of 25 minutes of legal time across two trials, setting a process in motion. And this is an accusation, or accusations against him, brought by the Victorian Police, to remind you, not the DPP in Victoria, that go to the period, not back when he was a priest in Ballarat who may have known and said nothing about a particular pedophile, but they're accusations against him personally, abusing children while he was Auxiliary Bishop of Melbourne and Archbishop of Melbourne. So it's pretty significant. I'm not passing any judgment on that. But the trial itself, he's become the lightning rod. You might say he's brought a lot of it on himself, and he was always, but he's the lightning rod for kind of anti-Catholic sentiment or anti-religious sentiment. He's the pinnacle of everything that's wrong with the church, according to the media. The Royal Commission, again, I don't need to explain. You've seen the media, you've seen people in and out, you've seen bishops, and all the archbishops of Australia were before the Royal Commission back in February for a period of about a week. Your own bishop was separately involved in appearing before the Royal Commission. And again, what happened before the Royal Commission, which is dealing with institutional abuse, a large proportion of it's Catholic, but we have so many Catholic schools and Catholic institutions, particularly historically, that's not a surprise. That's to be expected. And for those who think of it as an anti-Catholic, and there are some, including bishops, I'm afraid, who think of it as a purely anti-Catholic conspiracy or an anti-Catholic effort, at least, to denigrate religion and denigrate Catholics under the respectable cloak of a Royal Commission, well, that has to be dealt with and processed. And we saw the whole spectrum of opinion thinking about the future of the church and the future of dealing with issues like this when the bishops appeared before the Royal Commission. But here you've got the question of, you know, how these things were dealt with. That's the key issue. And it goes to the questions of power and authority and structure within the church. And a typical headline there from the Greens, of course, that the church of freedom of religion is just a cloak. It's just a smokescreen for when people talk about that, they're just trying to deflect attention from their guilt. The bottom one, I wasn't aware myself because it didn't seem to get publicity, but last week, 3 Australian bishops went to Rome to meet with the Archbishop, the Chief of the Vatican Political Service, Diplomatic Service, sorry, and several others. And I'm assuming, I'm surprised there hasn't been much commentary on it, I'm assuming that was to apprise them of what's likely to come out of the Royal Commission. The report comes down on the 15th of December. And what the Australian Church and the Australian bishops might be going to say about it. I imagine they're just softening Rome up for what's going to come as a result of that. Some themes, though, out of the Royal Commission. This is just a distillation, and some of these are... This is where the rubber hits the road, in a sense, I think, from the point of view of Catholic school leadership and anyone involved in church leadership. The spotlight has been on bishops, of course, and religious leaders, congregational leaders, and indeed principals. It's been really hard, hasn't it, to not get some of the flack from some of this in some places. It's very hard to avoid. We'd have to say the Royal Commission by itself, and we can't complain about it really, has trashed the Catholic brand. So being Catholic is not what it used to be in any kind of context. Churches, including and especially the Catholic Church, are just seen to be irrelevant, obsolete, and above all hypocritical. The worst thing you can do as a religious person, and you know, we wouldn't deny it either, is not to practice what you preach. And what have these churches been doing for years? Not practicing what they preach. So they're not worth listening to. They've lost their credibility. They've lost their authority, particularly their moral authority. And you, as Catholic school leaders, of course, are the embodiment of that authority, and for most people, you are the church, for many of your communities, particularly for the increasing numbers and proportions of non-Catholic families. You know, their only contact with capital C Catholic. The cover-up, of course, you understand. It's interesting that a lot of the Royal Commission, particularly in the latter part, and I think we'll see a lot of this in the report, has started to probe, well, what causes all this? What has given rise to all of this? There's been a lot of discussion about clericalism, the idea that the priesthood is so special and so different and so separate that it can't be queried, or when a person is ordained, they take on, this is of course the traditional teaching of an understanding of the church, they take on a special character, imprinted character from the Holy Spirit that sets them above what? Above what? And much of the discussion's been about that. Celibacy, again, a lot of predictable discussion about that. Is that or is that not a contributing cause? And therefore, you know, what does the Royal Commission do about that? Can it say to a church, you should, you know, this is something you've got to deal with, you've got a problem? Then there's the whole of the church's construction of sex. There's been a lot of discussion about that. The church's understanding and teaching traditionally of the sex and the purpose of sex, let alone sexuality. Is that the problem? That sex is only for reproduction and can't be for anything else for a short period of your life? Anyway, we won't go into the details of that, but it's likely to talk about things like that too. And my point, I think, is the church has to think about it. And the church is thinking about it in some places, as you know. You saw recently the discussion about the confessional seal. It was said the Royal Commission might make a recommendation that anyone reporting in confession child abuse, the priest is bound to break the confessional seal, in that case, to report the crime crime to the police, and there's probably a bit of a side issue, to be frank, but nonetheless it is typical of the impact I think the Royal Commission will have on the church itself. And then, of course, there's a whole question of law. Much of the defence, and many of the defences given in different hearings of the Royal Commission has been, well, I'm following canon law. I'm the bishop, I'm not responsible to anyone else, I take that responsibility seriously, so it begins here. And if I didn't deal with it, well, it wasn't his job to, or I'm the auxiliary bishop, and so on. You've heard all of that. Question is, and I think we're pretty clear about this, the Royal Commission will say, well, in all of these cases, these are criminal acts, the civil law takes precedent, canon law is irrelevant, and there'll be a bit of discussion about that too, and where the boundaries of that lie. Does canon law mean anything in these contexts that govern human behaviour in a society? There are new realities for the church, and I was struck, as you may have been, that one of the few people who've acknowledged this, from what I can see, and it's probably true because it made the Tablet, the English newspaper, was Bishop Vincent, the bishop of this diocese. And this, of course, he was talking about the priesthood and the education of priests, and how the Royal Commission means that we will have to think differently about the nature of priesthood, what it means to be a priest, how a priest works and acts and relates, and of course how a priest is chosen and formed and so on. And that, of course, is very true. But here we have at least one bishop already acknowledging that irrespective of what happens to the recommendations, because the recommendations are to government, the church has got a whole agenda out of the Royal Commission that it's going to have to act on. The same applies to Catholic schools. So here we are thinking about yourselves and your own job. Thinking differently, in a more sophisticated way, basically, around the theology of what's called the theology of sex. There'll be a lot of discussion about that, I expect, and a lot of discussion within school communities and with staff and so on. And the implications of that for curriculum, the implications of that for teaching, let alone personal behaviour in schools. So that's one thing you can anticipate. These are things you might anticipate, right? There'll be a rethink around governance, a lot of aspects of governance. You might think, well, I'm sick of governance. It's all I hear. What you've heard and what you've had to respond to has been the requirements and the dictates of the state in terms of governance and accountability. But this time it's going to be more from the church and how the church rethinks that relationship with schools, where schools fit, relationship with parishes, because the paradigm that's been evident over and over again in the Royal Commission is not the future. And so you'll be involved in that, I think. Your own bishop, as I mentioned a minute ago, has talked about the priesthood and the priestly formation, but the relationship of priests with schools. A lot of, again, the Royal Commission has been, well, the priest had access to children and special access this way, and the physical arrangements of it, or the expectations, the way the priest was dealt with, the principal never could speak against the priest, all that sort of stuff. That will be very much part of the agenda, and be new norms, if that's the phrase of the moment, new norms for dealing with all that sort of thing. And there's a job to be done. There's a job to be done educating Catholics and all those in Catholic schools about these and other related issues that is going to fall on your shoulders, I expect. So your job is going to be harder, really, from that point of view, and more challenging from that point of view. The Royal Commission, I don't know how long the report will be, but it'll be several volumes. There'll be probably hundreds of recommendations in it. On the 15th of December, there'll be a great fanfare. The recommendations will be to governments, state and Commonwealth. And in the present climate, particularly for sort of reasons we've outlined before, no government will be able to ignore them. And governments will probably fall over each other to quickly implement certain recommendations at least. And even if the church objects, even if we have a rerun of the marriage plebiscite debate in terms of church response, governments will move and we'll be on the back foot. which brings us to the question, well, where do governments and religion fit at the moment? How do they sit together and deal with each other? Well, governments are kind of religious. They have some religious trappings, one of which is the Lord's Prayer before every session of Parliament. And you might know there's suddenly, I think it's been a matter of indifference for years probably, but suddenly there's a movement to get rid of all the religious trappings of Parliament, that they are irrelevant and don't have a place. In fact, they're misleading in a modern industrial democracy like Australia. So that's coming. And redefining the roles of the state and church. The Royal Commission and others would say, well, the problem has been for government that churches have had too privileged a position and governments have pandered to them too often. Politicians and political leaders have pandered to bishops in a way that is not going to happen again. So there's a lot of that sort of thing. What's special about religion when the majority of Australians, or the largest group of Australians and in parliaments, is no religion? Why are parliaments paying so much attention to religion? There are a lot of religion, and the church, our Catholic Church as well, for a long time, has enjoyed a lot of special concessions and privileges, if you like. That's the language that's now used in relation to the way we conduct business, land ownership, a whole raft of things, let alone taxation, that will be under the microscope again. Why are churches given special treatment? Why is a Catholic Church, that wealthy Catholic Church, allowed off the hook so often on the way it does business and the tax concessions it has and so on? They should be good corporate citizens like the rest of us. All of that sort of thing. The protections that we've had, anti-discrimination protections, I suppose, especially, but others around that have come from a time when religion was seen to be good for society, good for people, and to be encouraged. The Catholic Church, of course, is still the largest outside government, the largest single provider of social welfare and social services in Australia. That probably won't change. And that is one aspect that governments will realise. They don't want to be putting that part of a church's business at risk, because then the responsibility will fall on government. There's the whole question of private belief. What you believe you should leave at the door of the Parliament. You don't bring into your legislation. You may have noticed that a few weeks ago there's a debate been going on in the Victorian Parliament about euthanasia. Well, we've all been worrying, bishops have been worrying about the marriage plebiscite. Euthanasia has been creeping up on the outside and may well pass it. It was said, well, the problem with the Victorian Parliament, there are too many products of Catholic education in the Parliament. That's the problem. And they're bringing their beliefs, they're letting their beliefs get in the road of their public responsibility as legislators. And I thought, wow, if ever there was a compliment for Catholic schools, there it is. We're producing too many people with a sense of public responsibility. The Parliament's full of Catholics, disproportionate, more than the portion of the population. So is the teaching force, so is nursing, and so is the police force, and so on. Well, I think that's a great advertisement for Catholic education. But here it's become a vice, or seen to be a vice. Taxation, we have all sorts of taxation provisions, but they're being asked. Questions being asked. Why? As I said a minute ago. But a lot of it is coming around the question of charity. The Catholic Education, well, what was the Catholic Education Commission in New South Wales? Put it this way, Catholic schooling in New South Wales is Australia's largest charity. That's to say, the largest amount of government money, which is nearly $3 billion, to a body that has charitable status. That's not at risk in any way. But the question of what do you have to do to keep your charitable status, to be deemed to be charitable, that is what will come into question in other parts of the church, I think, rather than education. In the case of education, it'll be what strings go with it, what extra strings must go with being a charity and claiming charitable status. So a lot more legislation and governance around that. Then we have the question of those who insist, particularly with the no religion, you've seen a lot of it recently, Australia is a secular society. Religion has no place. Think of some of those headlines there. Religion has no place in the marriage debate. Religion has no place in education and elsewhere. We would say no. And we've always said, no, no, no. We're not a secular society. We're a pluralist society. We're a society where people of all faiths and all ranges of belief and action and livelihood and capacity all exist together. This takes us right back to the taking a knee. What unites us? How do we focus on what unites us? What binds us together as a society and a culture, but particularly as a society? That's the Catholic view, that we are all children of God, we are all one in the eyes of God. So we're plural, we're not secularist as a society. That debate will go on, but we need to be more assertive in understanding that our rights and our freedoms exist because we are a pluralist society. A secularist society excludes them altogether. And then, of course, there's the lottery of the parliamentary process. We've got some relatively dysfunctional parliaments in Australia, and we probably all will have. That's a product of democracy and structure. What happens in those from time to time, certain parties and certain individuals, and you know what I'm talking about, have the balance of power. And that's the worst situation for, well, in my experience, it's the worst situation for Catholic education, because that's when you get pressure to trade things off. And ministers, of course, have to trade things off. That's the issue. So we're always going to be subject to that. What I'm saying there is that because of that process, we can expect, I think, some of our concessions or some of the things we might take for granted to get traded off or to be put under pressure, at least through that process. Just a couple of quick headlines to particularise some of those issues. You've seen, and we know it's not so much a Catholic school issue, but it's become a big government school issue. What's the role of religion or scripture in a government school? Well, scripture's had a place in government schools in New South Wales since time immemorial, since 1866, and still does in the Act. But there are movements now to get rid of religion from government schools, at least. And we've seen the debate around the growth of ethics classes as a substitute for scripture. That's part of that. The official prayers in Parliament we've talked about. And then not so much schools, because we have exemptions, but the exemptions that have existed for churches as employers in social welfare and other things, saying that the employee that they are taking on to deal with foster children or to deal with drug addicts, it matters who that person is, what that person's disposition is. That's, of course, become a major issue, and most of that, frankly, has already been taken care of. That's to say, it's been put beyond the anti-discrimination protections that the church has enjoyed as employer. Where does government and religious schools fit together? Now, this is right where we're at, okay? This is partly what we might anticipate, partly what's happening. I think I have to say initially that Catholic schools are financially secure. There's no risk about that. And their funding is financially secure, and it's bipartisan. The arguments that you see a lot of and hear a lot of are marginal compared to, the core business. No one's threatening to defund Catholic schools or to reduce funding for Catholic schools, but funding is evolutionary, and things change. The way funding relates, the way funding's calculated, and the strings attached to funding. They're the things that change, and they're going to keep on changing, and we're going to find some of those things a little bit more difficult to deal with in the future, I think. We're moving to a model that's going to be more based on per-student resourcing, identifying all the needs of individual students and aggregating those. That's a technical thing, but at the moment we just governments fund schools in a blanket way. There's more student tracking and student reporting. That's another agenda for another day. Obviously, a lot of discussion amongst the experts yesterday about that sort of thing. We're not far off full government funding of Catholic schools. and the question's being asked already, it hasn't been asked for 30 years, well, in that case, if the government, if the taxpayer's funding Catholic schools, then the taxpayer wants a bit more say. Or why don't we just give Catholic schools the option, or any government, non-government school I'm talking about, the option of becoming fully integrated into a single education system like New Zealand, so they don't have to worry anymore about other things too. That's something to think about. Legislation is, and the regulation, there's a kind of an incremental creep. You see it in each Education Act as it comes forward, and some of it really hits the road in your places, and the way you do your business, the forms you have to fill in, the reports you have to make, the tracking you have to engage in. That's when I got a groan before, when I mentioned governance, that's a consequence of that. It's the regulation that goes with legislation. Expect more of it. Expect more clear and more prescribed definition of the relations between school and church. That will be certainly one outcome of the Royal Commission. There will be financial implications and financial recommendations out of the Royal Commission. And they will be along the lines of making clearer where taxpayers' money goes when it's set aside for schools or social welfare or health, and it's provided to a religious entity like the Catholic Church. So, whereas at the moment, and traditionally it's been possible to perhaps move funding around here and there, and different dioceses have done it in different ways. That's going to be quite challenging for some. I don't need to elaborate, of course, that there's a whole set of moral and ethical issues. If I mention the Safe Schools program and the polarised public debate we had last year, not that it concerned many Catholic schools, but you can get a sense of more prescription around moral teaching in the curriculum. Well, if you're an Australian school, you teach this or you teach that, and you've only got your freedom to operate to teach what you have, your view of marriage, say, up to a certain point. More of that. Charitable status, I think I've explained. That idea that Australian society is secular, that schools should be secular, expect more of that too. And I think, this is not going to happen overnight, but within 10 years, I think governments will be at a point of saying, under pressure from a whole range of sources, including the ones we've outlined, the taxpayer only funds secular education. If you want to have religion or religious education, whether you're a Catholic school or an Anglican school or a Muslim school, that's your privilege. I'm not going to stop you, but you pay for it. If you think about it at the moment, people don't realise this, of course, but if you think about it at the moment, religion and the teaching of religion in Catholic schools is entirely funded by the taxpayer. That's to say, government grants pay the cost, more than pay the cost of the salary bill in every Catholic systemic school everywhere. And we say that religion, religious education, is an integral part, correctly, as an integral part of who we are, what we do, how we operate, what we stand for, and so it can't be separated out. Well, the time might not be far off where we're forced to separate it out for funding purposes. That's the meaning of those points. What scenarios? We're getting to the point of scenarios here. Remembering that that Catholic education this bit won't change. It's the church's, never mind the taxpayer, the church's biggest single investment is the Catholic school. We also are at a point now where we've pretty much reached the, thanks Mark, we've pretty much reached the end of the road, I think, for government funding. That's to say, we've maxed out. We've maxed out. We're just about to the point of maxing out. We have, and we know all this from my school. I hope you pay close attention to your my school data. We now know from my school, this is a time bomb we haven't had to deal with yet, but we will. We've got more and more Catholic schools that are funded more and more by governments than their local government school. That's a big issue and that has to be sorted out. Some cases it's by government grants alone, but more often than not it's because when you add fees to grants, you get ahead. How do you deal with that? Well, governments will do what they've been talking about from time to time. You put a cap on. Your fees can't go beyond a certain point because the resource level of the government and the Catholic school can't get too far apart. We've come from a time when the opposite was the case, and as we've moved forward, we've passed ourselves. Then, of course, once you move towards a more integrated system, ultimately, if that happens even without it, as there has been at various points, discussion about enrolment caps and new schools and so forth. I think the most immediate scenario is the loss of anti-discrimination protections which Catholic schools have had and maintained, and you as leaders have been able to deploy if necessary. Mainly around sex and mainly around sexuality. I think they're very vulnerable at the moment, and the Royal Commission may even recommend their abolition. It'll be very hard to argue against it, but other countries have dealt with this all along, and some also, thinking of that spectrum again, might say, well, then we have to deal with that, as we've always dealt with it, fairly and justly anyway. I've mentioned the government funding of the secular curriculum. That is part of a kind of a separation, a mental separation of religion and the secular. And in the case of the Catholic school, it's about religious practice. This is very hard to explain to others often, isn't it? That we don't just teach about religion, we don't just teach a certain view of human beings and their life and their meaning and God and so on. We have a set of practices. We practice it at school. We have rituals we participate in, things we do, and they're all tangled up. I've put World Youth Day in there as an example because I think that is as an activity in some places, I don't know Parramatta, but in some places it's become very entangled. And I would hate, and I've said this to bishops from time to time, you need to be very clear. If anyone asks the question, is there any government money, directly or indirectly, helping support students go off to World Youth Day, you'd better be clear about how you're going to explain it. So that will be one of the first things I think we will need to do as church leaders, as Catholic school leaders, be clear about and public about what's private and what's public, without compromising on the integrated nature and the integrated understanding of what a Catholic education is. So how do we, and there of course there are those who are saying, as they've always said, well, if that's the case, why don't we just throw our hands up and not bother? Remember that data there that we saw earlier on, Catholics have been leaving Catholic schools since 1988. And what does that say? And many of those are in that, well, I wouldn't bother category. What do? We advocate freedom of religion. We know what that means. I'm not going to elaborate on that. It's important for us to understand that better and to emphasise it more. I was just struck by that little photo there of Church Street and Gay Street. It's all part of that rhetorical anti-church approach. We resist freedom from religion. Thanks. Just about there now. We resist freedom from religion. Freedom from religion is a very American concept. I couldn't find an organisation in Australia that's called Freedom from Religion, but there is in America, and it prides itself on all the court cases it's succeeded in winning against churches and church schools, things that we wouldn't want to be contesting. And freedom of religion and freedom from religion are about rights. We would say it's an absolute right, the freedom of religion, whereas others would say, no, it's not. It's a compromised right. Well, I have the right to be free from your religion, thank you very much, and I don't want your religion intruding into my, not only my life, but also what I am as part of a society. Okay, so considering all that, here's your job. Keeping Catholic schools Catholic. It will involve It will involve, for all of us, all those involved in Catholic education, and for you too, it'll involve keeping control, really, I think that's the way to say it, over who teaches in your school. You want to have that say, don't you, as Catholic school leader? Over who enrolls in your school. You want to have some say about that without being, in accordance with all of the norms and all of the practices and all of the philosophies and values that you bring to it. What is taught, how it's taught, and how it's evaluated. They're all things that you take for granted now, but you mustn't take for granted. It'll involve resisting pressure, I think, to detach religion from education. You'll need to think about that. Some of that you may not have a choice about, and not tomorrow, but down the track. But you need to be more sensitive about it locally. If your parents have no religion, and a large proportion of them start coming to you and saying, well, I want my child exempted from anything religious in this school. I don't want the religious bit. Some of you may have had that already. I don't want the religious bit. So can he be exempted from RE classes, for example? Can he be exempted from class masses, and so on? Because religion is something, and this might be a case with staff, religion is my business in the Catholic school. It's private, amongst consenting adults in private, so don't trouble me with any of the other bits. It'll involve reclaiming, I think. That's to say, you may already have claimed it and are confident with it, but reclaiming and articulating what a religious education is. The essential character and purpose of a religious education is something you do all the time. Again, we may need to find fresh ways of explaining it, of justifying it and proclaiming it and being confident about it with staff and with parents. And of course, particularly in high schools, increasingly with high schools, with senior students. A couple of examples that I know, just to backtrack a bit, a couple of examples I know of where students have left the Catholic school in the course of this year. It's been around the same-sex marriage debate. And it's been the child's initiative saying to the parents, I don't want to be at that Catholic school anymore. I think what they're preaching about or what they're thinking about or what the church is thinking about, irrespective of the school, about same-sex marriage, I can't, as a 16-year-old or 17-year-old, I can't countenance. So I'm going to the state high school, but you organise it, please, Mum. So it's Catholic education is an education in religion, for religion. It's religiously motivated, characterised by it, and it's for everybody there. And just ask yourself that question again. Well, why would someone of no religion at all want to be part of a Catholic school? You'll tell them, and convincingly. So retaining the initiative is understanding the religious composition of your own school. I'm not saying you don't understand it now, but you really need to be clear about the religious composition of your school, the communities, the parents, the staff. You may be familiar with them, know them all well. You may not have thought too much if I asked you to say, do you know who the non-religious, the no-religion families are in your school? Do you know? It's a matter of awareness, of course, and being sensitive about it. We're not saying this is this is all negative. This is about being sensitive to it and taking it on and integrating it, articulating and defending freedom of religion. You want to retain the right to practice, to preach and to practice at the same time, your faith, your ideals, both privately within the school and publicly, within the rituals of the school and with the school in the community. The identity issue, the identity politics that's racking America over the taking a knee, and arguably here too, the idea that my identity is purely internal to me and purely personal to me, that's not the Catholic view, of course. So it's understanding that, but reasserting that that's all very well, I respect that you're gay, I respect that you're female, that you're black, or whatever. But being Catholic means that we are always think about ourselves as part of a community, part of a society, part of a universe, in fact. It's an all-embracing thing. Being Catholic, the word, of course, means universal. Catholic means universal, and that's the summation of it. But the final one is you need to keep reminding people that a Catholic education is contemporary. It's modern. I don't need to say that to you in Parramatta, I don't think, but to remind people that it's in touch with what education's about, what that process is, and that it's going on all over the world. It's part of something that is a universal enterprise. And that our schools, our Catholic schools, are forces for good. They're not divisive. They're not counterproductive. They're not antisocial. They're forces for good, for human good, for personal good, and for social good. So that's your agenda, really. And I want to conclude on this most recent quote from the Church has a whole range of documents, as you know, and you'll be familiar with many of them, on education and what education might be, what characterises it. This is the most recent one, April this year, issued by the Congregation for Catholic Education, educating to fraternal humanism. The language, as often in these things, is very churchy, and it's, you need to read it twice to see what it's saying. But what it's saying is that, and it's a timely reminder, religions, we're a pluralist society, religions can help coexistence within society rather than hinder it. Religion is a force for good, not counterproductive, as so often being called. Religions can significantly contribute to achieving the social objectives of peace and justice. That's part of the communal, isn't it? That's part of the universal mission of the Catholic school, the Catholic community, and us, each of us as Catholics. And it calls on religious beliefs to profess their positive ethical values in public. That's to say, being out and proud, to use other language from another place, but about the values, and to be confident and confidently proclaim what's Catholic, why it's good for you, what a Catholic education really is, and why that's good for you. It's going to be hard, but I'm sure you're all up to it.